talking about phrases. We defined what phrases are. We've looked at prepositional phrases and appositives. We've looked at different kinds of verbal phrases. And I'll bet some of you probably have been asking this question in the back of your mind. Gee, with all these phrases that we're looking at, how do you diagram phrases? And that, in case you've been wondering, is a very good question. How do we diagram sentences with phrases? Let's look at prepositional phrases first. They're probably the easiest to diagram. What you know about diagramming already should help you with diagramming prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases modify. So they go below the noun, pronoun, or verb that they modify. Right? They're adjectives or adverbs. So they normally go below the word they modify. However, a prepositional phrase, unlike an ordinary adverb or adjective, includes an object. An object of nouns and pronouns normally go on horizontal lines. So the preposition goes on the diagonal below the word being modified, just as other modifiers do, and the object goes on a horizontal line that extends at the end of the preposition. And modifiers go under the object, just as modifiers go under any other word that's being modified. So, the preposition goes on the diagonal below the word being modified, just as other modifiers do. So, let's see. Let's say we had a word being modified by a prepositional phrase. Okay. Modifiers go on diagonals under the word they modify. So the preposition goes on a diagonal like that. And then we understand objects are nouns or pronouns. They go on horizontals, so you extend a horizontal line out like that, and you put the object of the preposition on the horizontal line. And, you know, if there are any modifiers, then, you know, any adjectives, articles modifying the object, they would go underneath the way modifiers always do. So, simple example. He is King of Kings. If you remember, for diagramming, we'll always start with the verb first, because every sentence has a verb. Most sentences have subjects as well, unless they're imperative or dropped for another reason. So, is the verb. He is the subject. Okay, king is predicate nominative, predicate noun. So we put that on the main line with the diagonal separating it from the verb. And then of kings is a prepositional phrase modifying king. Which king? The King of Kings. So, of goes on the diagonal, preposition goes on the diagonal. The object of the preposition goes on a horizontal at the end, extending at the end of the diagonal. Just like that. Okay. Look at that for a minute, contemplate that, write it down in your notes. He is King of Kings, of kings. Preposition, object of preposition, under the word being modified. Okay, here's a little more complicated sentence. You might remember this from our previous lesson on prepositional phrases. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, whether on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth. Okay. The verb is should bow. Who or what should bow? Knees. Every knee. So knee is the subject. Every modifies knee. Okay. At the name of Jesus, if you think about it, really is an adverbial phrase. And so it modifies the verb. When do they bow? Under what conditions do they bow? At the name of Jesus. So, at goes on the diagonal. Remember, since at is the first word of the sentence, it is capitalized. So the reader looking at the diagram knows which word comes first. Okay. Name is the object of the preposition. The modifies name. And then of Jesus is a prepositional phrase modifying name. So, which name? Or whose name? The name of Jesus. So again, the preposition on the diagonal under name. Jesus, the object of the preposition on the horizontal. Okay, whether on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth, answers the question, where? Also modifying the verb. Only instead of saying when they're bowing, where they're bowing. Notice in this case, there is a conjunction joining the three prepositional phrases. So we have on, earth. I don't know if we're going to have enough room here. Wow. The modifying earth. Above earth. The. And below. And I'm running out of room, so I'll just use the... Is that the sign for earth? I think so. Isn't it the round circle with the dot in the middle, isn't it? Okay, and in this case, because there are conjunctions, you know, remember we put the dotted lines, and whether and or. Okay, because this is a, you know, conjunctions go onto the dotted line like that. Okay, a little more complicated, but hopefully you can see how this works. Okay. If the adverbial phrase modifies an adjective or another adverb, you draw a short line perpendicular to that line the modifier is on, and then draw the diagonal for the preposition and the horizontal for the object. Basically the same way you do it if you have, say, an adverb modifying a modifier. You know, sometimes we have the adverbs modifying an adjective or another adverb. So the same kind of thing, except you, instead of just putting an adverb on it, you put the whole prepositional phrase on. So 6 bridesmaids arrived too late for the wedding. Okay, so once again, the verb of the sentence is arrived. Okay, the subject is bridesmaids. Okay, 6, the capital X, S modifies bridesmaids. Okay, too late for the wedding. Okay, so they arrived late. And remember, to is an adverb modifying late. Remember how we do that? We stick the It can be perpendicular, it can be horizontal, the other line doesn't really make much difference. So too late, and then for the wedding also modifies late. You could make a case that it modifies the verb, and I would probably give you credit for it, but it's really, it's not that they arrived for the wedding, they modified late for the wedding. So the preposition on the diagonal the object of the preposition on the horizontal, and of course in this case there is the modifying wedding. Okay, so if you have an adverbial prepositional phrase modifying a adverb or adjective, it is connected the same way that to the modifier that an adverb modifying the adjective or adverb is. Okay. Okay. If a prepositional phrase has a compound object, you split the object line just as you would with a compound subject or a compound verb. Modifiers go under the specific object they modify. If the modifier modifies both objects, oops, that should be objects, they go under the horizontal line before it splits. And here are some examples of what I'm talking about. Pairs of tough soldiers and salty sailors marched into parade. Hey, look, I had to come up with a sentence, probably not the most elegant, but it makes sense. Okay, so verb is marched. Subject is pairs. Remember, soldiers and sailors are both objects of the preposition of, so they're not the subject. Okay, in the parade, we'll do that one first because that one's obvious. In the parade tells us where, modifies march. Okay. Okay, so in the preposition on the diagonal, object parade, on the horizontal, the, on diagonal under the object, modifying parade, and then tough soldiers and salty sailors. Okay, we have one preposition and a compound object, soldiers and sailors. Okay, so pairs of, and then we split the line, just as we would with any kind of compound. Okay, so soldiers and sailors. Okay, and then tough modifies soldiers, and salty modifies sailors. And of course you have the conjunction on the dotted line. So I can meditate on that for a minute. So, and if you have a compound object of a preposition, this is how you would do it. Now, occasionally, and I'll show this on the next page, occasionally you will have a compound object of preposition that has a modifier, a single modifier that modifies both words. So, for example, pairs of American soldiers and sailors marched in the parade. Okay, in this case, it's basically the same sentence, except in this case, American modifies both soldiers and sailors. Okay, so in this case then, the predicate is exactly the same as the previous one. Okay, marched in the parade, preposition, object of preposition, modifier of the object. Okay, subject is the same, pairs of, but in this case, the only difference is, okay, we have soldiers, sailors, dotted line for the conjunction, and in this case the word American, because it modifies both soldiers and sailors, goes on the horizontal object line before it splits. And if you think about it, it did the same thing if you had a modifier modifying a compound subject, or a modifier modifying a compound verb, or a modifier modifying a compound direct object. Same pattern. You've probably done this before with other sentence parts, but you do the same thing with compound objects of prepositions. Now, diagramming appositives is a little different. And remember, appositives are noun phrases. So there is always a noun or pronoun that is the main word in the appositive. Okay, so the main noun or pronoun in the appositive phrase follows the noun or pronoun that it names on the same line in a pair of parentheses. Any modifiers, including prepositional phrases, go below the noun or pronoun. So, simple example. Alexander the Great conquered the world. Okay, this is off the top of my head. Okay. Conquered, direct object, world. The modifies world. Ooh, Alexander the Great. Ooh. So, it's not just any Alexander, but Alexander the Great. Therefore, we need to leave room for the appositive. And then the modifies great. Okay, simple example, but it's the same line as the noun or pronoun it renames with the main noun of the appositive in parentheses and the modifiers below the noun, just as any other noun being modified. Okay, let's take a look at a sentence. John, a Galilean fisherman, became known as the beloved disciple. Okay, so I'm going to have to leave plenty of room for the appositive. Okay. The verb is became. I guess you could say the verb is became known, or probably be more precise. Known is the predicate adjective. Okay, known as. In this case, it's a preposition. Disciple and beloved, modifying disciple. Oh, and the, also modifying disciple. Okay, and then for the appositive, John is the subject, Galilean fisherman is the appositive, and of course, fisherman is the noun part of the noun phrase, so we put fisherman in the parentheses, and then a and Galilean, on diagonals modifying fishermen. So see how that works. Okay. Really pretty simple. Because it's a noun, it goes on a horizontal line. Because it's renaming another noun that's already on a horizontal line, it goes on the same line. The noun it renames is the main noun of the appositive is in parentheses. So I think you can see how that works. If an appositive is a compound appositive, the noun line is split just as you would split other compound word parts. So you need certain ingredients for clam chowder. Okay, and then this ends with an appositive. And remember, positives can be set off by dashes, and often at the end of sentences, especially if it's a list, with a colon, as we see here. Okay. So, in this case, our appositive is after the direct object. So, need is the verb, you is the subject. Need what? Need ingredients. Okay. Certain modifies ingredients. And then for clam chowder also modifies ingredients. So prepositional phrase. For chowder, clam tells us what kind of chowder, so it modifies chowder. And then the appositive, in this case it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, compound appositive 6 ways. So we split the line into 6. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. And then we would put each element in parentheses. Clams, onions, potatoes, milk, cream, and certain spices. And then smooth that up a little bit. Certain modifying spices, and then dotted line, conjunction, and. Okay. Oops. Close that parenthesis there. Okay. This is pretty extreme, but shows you how it would be done. Okay. Take a minute to meditate upon that and maybe copy down an example. If you're including in your notes, I suppose you could leave out a couple of ingredients for the sake of your notes, although I would not leave out any of the ingredients for the sake of the clam chowder. Okay. And if the compound appositive is in the middle of the sentence, the noun line is split and then reunited in the same way a compound verb with a single object is. Okay, or, yeah. So, 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, accompanied Jesus up the mountain. Notice, remember, I'm using dashes here because the appositive itself has a few commas. I mean, you can do it with commas, but it can be a little confusing to the reader, so it's usually helpful if you do it this way. Okay. Okay, accompanied is the verb. Accompanied whom or what? Accompanied Jesus, so Jesus is the direct object. Where did they go? Up the mountain. Okay, modifies the verb. It's not Jesus is up the mountain, they accompanied him up the mountain. So up mountain is the object. Modifies mountain. Okay. And then, of course, the subject is disciples. Three modifies disciples. And then Peter, James, and John. So we would split the line three ways and then reconnect it like that. So we have Peter, James, and each one in parentheses because it's in a positive, and John. Okay, and of course, and on the dotted line where conjunctions normally go. So, I think you can see how that works. And this is pretty unusual, doesn't happen too often, but this is what you do if it does happen and you're diagramming an appositive this way in the middle of a sentence. So, now you have learned how to diagram prepositional phrases, preposition on the diagonal just as a modifier, a horizontal extending out from that diagonal with the object of the preposition, any modifiers, of course, going under the object, and you've learned how to diagram appositives on the same line as the noun they describe, with the noun part of the appositive in parentheses, any modifiers of that noun below it, just as you would have any other modifiers. So, I hope you've learned something, and I hope this has answered your question, at least begun to answer your question about diagramming phrases.